Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath, Radha Gopinath, Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Ashtatara Satashi Shrimad Divine Grace of Vaichanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Jai Nithai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto number 3, Chapter number 5, text, Vidura's Talks with Maitreya. Text number 28. Sopyam saguna kalatma. Sopyam saguna kalatma. Bhagavad drishti gochara. Bhagavad drishti gochara. Atmanam vyakarod atma. Atmanam vyakarod atma. Visvas yasya shishrikshaya. Visvas yasya shishrikshaya. Sopyam saguna kalatma. Bhagavad drishti gochara. Atmanam vyakarod atma. Visvas yasya shishrikshaya. Sopyam sopyapsya gunakalatma. Bhagavad drishti gochara. Atmanam vyakarod atma. Visvas yasya shishrikshaya. Sopyam saguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gochara Atmanam vyakarod atma Vishwasyasya shishikshaya. Word for word, Saha Mahat Tattva Api also Amsa Purusha plenary expansion Guna chiefly the quality of goodness, chiefly the quality of ignorance. Kala the duration of time. Atma full consciousness. Bhagavat the personality of Godhead. Drishti gocharaha range of sight. Atmanam many different forms. Vyakarot differentiated. Atma reservoir. Vishvasya the would-be entities. Asya of this. Sisrikshaya generates the false ego. Thereafter the Mahat translation and purport by His Divine Grace Abhayachan Aravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Jagadguru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. Thereafter the Mahat Tattva differentiated itself into many different forms as the reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance and it generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. Purport. The Mahatattva is the via medium between pure spiritual and material existence. It is a junction of matter and spirit wherefrom the false ego of the living entity is generated. All living entities are differentiated parts and parcels of the personality of Godhead. Under the pressure of false ego, the conditioned souls, or those part and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, claim to be the enjoyers of material nature. This false ego is the binding force of material existence. The Lord again and again gives a chance to the bewildered conditioned souls to get free from this false ego. And that is why the material creation takes place at intervals. He gives the conditioned souls all facilities for rectifying the activities of the false ego, but He does not interfere with their small independence as parts and parcels of the Lord. Translation again. Thereafter the Mahatattva differentiated itself into many different forms as a reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly the mode of ignorance and it generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padhan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gurudvishe Namaha Vancha Kalpatarobhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shiva Sadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Namo Vishnu Padaya Vishnu Vishnu Padaya. Hare Krishna. So we are reading from the chapter of Vidura's talks with Maitreya, which is quite interesting when you think about when someone talks with another person. It's hi, hello, how are you? Is your health good? Everything going well? But here Vidura's talks with Maitreya talks about the creation. So all the way down to the minute particles, including the Panchabhuta, the earth, water, fire, air, ether, and all of those things. So it's a very interesting talk Vidura has with Maitreya, and it's very interesting that most of us will also switch off at this point, because it's a very difficult or technical point where we talk about the creation of the material universe. Previously we read in a purport, Prabhupada was explaining that actually the material nature is like a wife, like a husband has many wives. Material nature is like a co-wife of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and therefore to engage in I guess a relationship with the wife, co-wife, similarly the Lord wakes up the sleeping energy, Maya, so that he can enjoy with her. But here the enjoyment of the enjoyment of the Lord is actually not how to say, some sort of sadistic enjoyment where he enjoys waking up material nature and then seeing the living entities suffer in there. Rather, his enjoyment is that the whole process is to enliven the sleeping conditioned souls to the real life of spiritual consciousness, so that they may thus become as perfect as the ever liberated souls in Vaikuntha Lokas. Sentence before that. This is same chapter, text, Canto 3, Chapter 5, text number 24. In that purport, Prabhupada says, "It is the compassion of the Lord for the sleeping energy that he wants to see her awaken for enjoyment like the other wives who are awake." But previous to that, Prabhupada says, the Lord is so kind that in the absence of such a manifestation, he feels something wanting and thus creation takes place. Previous to that, the Lord wanted to create the cosmic manifestation to give another chance to the conditioned souls who are dormant in forgetfulness. So the cause of this material creation is us, but the Lord is the ultimate cause, because without his sanction, without his desire, nothing is manifest, nothing comes into existence. So it is our desire to enjoy separately from the Lord that has caused this material creation to awaken and then again go back to its sleeping state. Now, this Mahat Tattva, referring to Bhagavat Subodhini, here is mentioned that this Mahatattva, it's quite interesting, because if you read in the previous text, Prabhupada says here, or rather Maitreya says that, text 27, thereafter influenced by the interaction of eternal time, excuse me, the supreme sum total of matter called the Mahatattva became manifest, and in this Mahatattva, the unalloyed goodness, the Supreme Lord sowed the seeds of universal manifestation out of his own body. So thereafter, Prabhupada then says that actually thereafter the Mahatattva differentiated itself into many different forms as a reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance. So there's some transformation that's happened in between, and Bhagavat Subodhini actually captures it pretty well. So here we have initially the Karanadakashaya Vishnu, and then through his glance, time and the jivas then enter into pradhan, or the material nature, where the three modes of nature are inactive. Once it's activated, then you have the Mahat Tattva. And in the Mahat Tattva, it's mentioned that there is the Mahat Tattva in Sattva, then there's this talk about this Rajas, or this creative potency that's within this particular Mahatattva, and also the Jnana Shakti, which is the Sattva. So I'll take a step back again. So the Mahatattva, when produced from the Lord's glance from Pradhan, then you have Mahatattva mixed with the modes of material nature. So a technical point here, that it's mentioned that this mixing with the modes of nature, Mahatattva in Sattva is known as the Jnana Shakti, and the Mahatattva in Rajas, this is a very interesting point here, because actually nothing is mentioned about the Lord's Mahatattva in connection with Rajagun in this particular section of Bhagavatam. But Subodhini then refers us to 11th canto, where Uddhava is speaking to, or rather Krishna is speaking to Uddhava, and he's mentioning to Uddhava that actually along with the Mahatattva comes what's known as the Sutra Tattva, and that is the passion, the guna of passion in effect. So previously we saw in Pradhan the three modes were ineffective or inactive. Mahatattva is the activation of the three modes of nature, and Mahatattva in Sattva Gun is known as the Jnana Shakti of the Lord. The Sutra Tattva, which is in Rajagun, is known as the Kriya Shakti of the Lord, or the action potency of the Lord, or the activity. So that's 27 and 28. And 29 will then talk about how Ahankar comes into the picture. So Ahankar is sort of introduced in 28, but in 29 we'll learn more about how the Mahatattva and the Ahankar, they mix together and produce the mind, the senses and the elements. So that's coming in the next verse, next purport. So that's sort of a technical overview. So that's a sort of a flow or overview of what we're reading about now. Now, I wanted to touch more, this purport talks about the false ego as the junction or the medium between pure spirit and material existence. In the, I believe it's the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, I think it is mentioned there. It's mentioned that Asanga Hiyama Ayam Purusha, that the living entity is Asanga, not really connected with the material nature. It's separate from material energy. And Krishna says that in Bhagavad Gita, Bhumirapo nalo vayo kammano buddhirevacha hankara itiyam me bina pakritirastada. That's the separate energies: earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. But then he tells Arjuna, actually there's something more than that. Aparayam tva itastvanyam viddhime prakritim param jiva bhuta mahabaho yayedam dharyate jagat. That actually the living entity, the jiva, which is spiritual by nature, is actually maintaining or holding up this material creation, because it is para. Vishnu prokta para, Vishnu Shakti para prokta, Chetragya tata para. When Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu reaches Varanasi, actually he had finished his tour of Vrindavan, and he decided to leave Vrindavan and go towards Jagannath Puri through Varanasi, Benares. So then when he had reached Varanasi into the house of Chandrasekhar Acharya, at that point Sanatana Goswami then met the Lord. But when Sanatana Goswami came and met the Lord, he had appeared in front of the house. Actually Mahaprabhu said, you just go to your door and there you'll find a great Vaishnava. But because Sanatana Goswami had left the association and the employment of the Nawab Hussain, then he had gone through the whole land all the way up until Benares from Ramkeli in a Mohammedan attire. So he had a beard and he was unkempt. And so when he went out, when Chandrasekhar Acharya went outside of his home to have a look at where this Vaishnava had appeared, he saw a Mohammedan, a Muslim. And he was confused. Mahaprabhu was saying a Vaishnava is here, but here we're seeing a Muslim. So he went back inside and asked Mahaprabhu. And Mahaprabhu then again came out, and then it was introduced Sanatana Goswami, and there was a loving exchange between the Lord and Sanatana Goswami. But later on, Mahaprabhu actually instructs Sanatana Goswami. And he instructs Sanatana Goswami in the science of the absolute truth. This is Madhya Lila, chapter 20. Madhya Lila, chapter 20, and we're starting from text number 100. So here Sanatana Goswami is mentioning something very interesting. So I'm talking about Asanga Hi Ayam Purusha, that the junction between the living entities and material nature is false ego. And when Sanatana Goswami talks to the Lord, this particular section of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita talks a lot about the nature of the living entity as being separate from material existence. And this is a very important point, because material scientists or material, Prabhupada often calls us Gyanis, or those who are somewhat resemble intellectuals, they are all under the illusion of Maya, Maya apahita jnana. Their knowledge has been taken away by Maya, and their understanding is that simply we are the body. There is only one energy, that is material existence, and we are that existence, material energy. That's all. Nothing else exists. If there is any symptom of life, it is just emanating from material nature, and it will disappear. Whereas spiritual knowledge, the absolute truth, is the other way around. That material existence comes from spiritual existence, and material existence is temporary. So it's completely flipped the way around. Just like in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that when one is in ignorance, one sees what is to be good as bad, what is to be done dharma as adharma, and one sees adharma as dharma. So in ignorance, this knowledge has been flipped around. So it is very important to understand the marginal potency of the Lord in relationship with the inferior and superior energy of the Lord. And here the whole crux of the matter relies on this false ego. So coming back to the conversation of Mahaprabhu with Sanatana Goswami, he very humbly submits himself to the Lord. A few classes ago, Bhava Bhushan Prabhu actually touched upon this, that he was mentioning about how the mood of Sanatana Goswami was. That, look, let's see where it is. I was born in a low family and my associates are all low-class men. I myself am fallen and am the lowest of men. Indeed, I have passed my whole life fallen in the well of sinful materialism. And this verse I like very much. Apanara hita hiti kichu na jani, gramya vyavahare pandit na satyamani. I do not know what is beneficial for me or what is detrimental. Nonetheless, in ordinary dealings, people consider me a learned scholar, and I am also thinking myself as such. So this is Sanatana Goswami manifesting or showing, just like Arjuna went into ignorance in the Bhagavad Gita, here Sanatana Goswami out of humility is portraying the nature of the soul under false ego. But Sanatana Goswami is completely different in that sense, because he recognizes that Mahaprabhu, out of your causeless mercy, you have delivered me from the materialistic path. Now by the same causeless mercy, please tell me what my duty is. So here he's saying that, who am I? Why do the threefold miseries always give me trouble? If I do not know this, how can I be benefited? So why are we studying about the manifestation of material existence? Is to help us detach. Prabhupada says actually in a purport that the whole point of understanding material nature is that we should understand it is miserable and we should be induced to give it up. Therefore we study material nature. When we study the technical details of how material creation comes into existence, then we lose that so-called romantic idea of material existence. We start to see material existence for what it is. Just simply inert, inanimate matter. That's all it is. And we see it in relationship with the Lord. And we then realize that no matter how much we interact with material nature, we'll never get any reciprocation. And that the reciprocation comes from engaging in Krishna's devotional service. That being induced, that kick or that desire to understand more about spiritual life comes from being kicked in material existence again and again repetitively by Maya. So here, who am I? Why do the threefold miseries always give me trouble? If I do not know this, how can I be benefited? This is the basic question we should always have in relation to material existence, in relation to our own existence. Because this is actually the main questions we should be asking. Not, what's for breakfast today, or, is it going to rain, is it going to shine, what's the weather? These things are all secondary. These come after we understand who we are and what our activities should be. So here, he's saying that actually I do not know the I do not know how to inquire about the goal of life and the process for obtaining it. So here Sanatana Goswami immediately shows how we should be very humble and how our mood should be after having understood the creation of material existence, and how the Lord out of His compassion has created material existence for our enjoyment, although He doesn't want it. Right? He doesn't want the material existence to come into effect for the living entities to want and enjoy and be in forgetfulness. He doesn't want that. So the mood of a devotee then is that to always approach the Lord in humility. Prabhupada says liberation is achieved by Krishna consciousness. And what is the first point? The first point is of surrender. You want to be liberated in Krishna consciousness, that's good, well and good. But what is the first point? The first point is of surrender. And Krishna is so kind, Shri Radha Gopinath is so kind that even a fraction, a small percentage of surrender, if your whole life is you engage it, like Prabhupada says to Bhakti Chara Maharaj, that simply so many lifetimes you have engaged in your own sense gratification, simply give this one life to Krishna. So in the same way, in this life, Shri Radha Gopinath is so merciful that if they see just that 1% of surrender, they'll give the experience of liberation, a glimpse, although you're completely unqualified. But that's not what the ultimate goal of life is, just simply liberation from material existence. It is kind of like, you're banging your head against the wall and then you stop for a moment and you feel, that feels kind of good, right? That's just a temporary relief from material existence. It is not the complete thing. Therefore, one should engage in devotional service. So Mahaprabhu then starts talking about the potencies of the Lord. Just see, Sanatana Goswami is asking, who am I? Why am I suffering? And immediately Mahaprabhu is teaching about the potencies of the Lord. Those who are eager to awaken their spiritual consciousness and those who have unflinching, undeviated intelligence certainly attain the desired goal of life very soon. So he's glorifying Sanatana Goswami for asking these questions. Now, I'll come to the main point. This is text number 110. 110. Give me a second. So Mahaprabhu is quoting Bhagavad Gita, Aparayam Tvest itisteme anyam viddi me prakatim param jiva bhuta mahabaho yayadam jarite jagat. Krishna Buli se jeev anadir bahimukh atev maya tar de samsar dukh. That forgetting Krishna, the living entity has been attracted by the external feature from time immemorial. This is false. This is the beginning of the junction. This is how the living entity and material nature come into association. Therefore, the illusory energy Maya gives him all kinds of misery in his material existence. So why are we learning about the Mahatattva? Why are we learning about the false ego? Actually, this is the beginning point. This is the junction which causes the living entity to continuously suffer in material existence due to forgetfulness of the self. And Prabhupada is saying that as soon as the living entity forgets his constitutional position as a servant of Krishna, he's entrapped by the illusory energy. So here Prabhupada in this purport is mentioning that the living entity is called marginal energy because by nature he's spiritual, but by forgetfulness he's situated in material energy. Thus he has the position to either live in the material or spiritual energy. So then Mahaprabhu then immediately tells him that actually the way it works is the living entity sometimes goes up to a higher standard of life or then goes down to a very difficult standard of life. Just like how a king will punish a criminal by dunking him in water. So the living entity, although going up or down, is suffering, just like a criminal being dunked in water. And the way it works is that the criminal will then be dunked in water until he's unable to breathe. Then he comes out of the water and takes one deep breath. And then again he's dunked back down. But is that really happiness? Is that really a relief to take a breath and then go back down into drowning? So Mahaprabhu is explaining that actually no, this is not the real situation of the living entity. And then he quotes again Kavi, Rishi, one of the Nava Yogendras talking to Maharaj Nimi. that bhayam dvitiya biniveshitasyad isharapetyasya vipariyosmiti tan mayato buddha abhajet tam bhaktyai guru devatma. That Devatma. When the living entity is attracted by material energy, which is separate from Krishna, he is overpowered by fear. Because he is separated from the Supreme Personality of Godhead by material energy, his conception of life is reversed. Reversed means that he thinks himself the Lord. In other words, instead of becoming the eternal servant of Krishna, he becomes Krishna's competitor. This is called Viparya Yosmiti. You can think about it, like if you try to compete with Krishna, of course you'll always be in fear, because Krishna will always defeat you. So naturally you'll always be in fear. To nullify this mistake, one who is actually learned and advanced worships the Supreme Personality of Godhead as his spiritual master, worshipful deity and source of life. He thus worships the Lord by the process of unalloyed devotional service. So in this verse, very nicely, you can see the example of how we want to be Krishna's competitor in Kamsa. Kamsa lived his life completely in fear after Krishna had advented, because he was constantly thinking of himself as a competitor of the Lord. Whereas the devotees, when Krishna appeared, they felt very happy and satisfied. In fact, they didn't care for Kamsa. It's mentioned that as soon as the Lord appeared, everything was situated in such a peaceful situation that originally the Brahmanas who were being harassed for not performing yajna, they very peacefully started performing yajna. They didn't care for Kamsa. So the devotees, they give up all fear when they're in relation, when they understand the constitutional position of the Lord and remain in that position. Whereas when the living entity reverses the situation and tries to compete with Krishna, that's when all difficulties of life begin. So here, this forgetful of Krishna is the cause of miseries of material existence. And since when? Since time immemorial. But the jiva always exists. So this forgetfulness of Krishna appears since time immemorial. Because of that forgetfulness of Krishna, we suffer and enjoy, so-called enjoy, happiness and distress in this material existence. But the living entity is always separate from it. It exists separately from material existence. Ahasanga ayam hi purusha. Actually, the living entity, this conditioned existence of the living entity is just somewhat like a dream. It's not a permanent situation of the living entity. It is not the constitutional existence. It's not an existential position. It is a illusory state of consciousness. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that the living entity and the Lord, they are compared to two birds living on a tree. Now the Mayavadis will talk about how a parrot will, when it enters a green tree, it merges into the tree. But actually it doesn't merge. The color and is the same, so it's very difficult to see, but the individuality still remains. The tree is the tree, the parrot is the parrot. So in this example of the bird sitting on the tree, there are two existences that are separate from the material existence, which is the tree. And that's the super soul and the jiva. And the jiva is trying to enjoy material existence by eating the fruits of happiness and distress. But the super soul is waiting for the jiva to turn to him. So you can understand that the jiva is separate from material existence. This is a very important point to understand. Because once you understand you're separate from material existence, and you understand that you're actually spiritual by nature, then you'll make endeavor to get out. But if you think yourself part of this material existence, then the modus operandi, or the activities you will perform as your core essence of life, is simply to enjoy material existence. Because there's nothing better to do. Even though you're repeatedly kicked and suffering from material existence, still you'll make up some philosophy and you'll continue to try and enjoy material existence. I think previously in one Bhagavatam verse, there Prabhupada was mentioning that the living entity's principle of life is that they'll work very hard to achieve something, but then material existence will then destroy it. Like sandcastles, the living entity will try and produce a sandcastle by the sea, and then the tide will come and take it away. or the famous example Prabhupada says, I've endeavored so hard to build a house, but now there's a fire and it's all burnt down to ashes. So this is material existence, that you endeavor for something and you always get the opposite result. Nimittani viparitani keshava. Arjuna mentions this in the Bhagavad Gita. The first two chapters of Bhagavad Gita is a dramatic display of the living entity in material existence. That Arjuna is saying, look, Krishna, I'm supposed to fight, and the reason why I'm fighting is to gain the kingdom and then rule properly along with my relatives. But if I do that, then I'll kill the very same relatives that I want to maintain according to Dharma. But if I don't do that, I will die. So it's confusing. What should I do? The very thing I'm acting for will then gives me a reverse reaction against my will. What should I do? So obviously what Arjuna did was take shelter of Krishna. And that's the solution. You see, the jiva is always free from contamination. But we are stuck in thinking that we are the body. So material existence has two potencies. Maya has two functions by which she ensnares the living entity, and that's a prakshabatmika and avaranatmika. That she covers the intelligence of the living entity and she drags him down. Birth after birth, the living entity then forgets the original position he's in. So what should one do to then reverse the situation? Prabhupada mentions that miseries come about due to our trying to gratify our senses. The core reason why we suffer in material existence is that we're trying to satisfy our senses. So what is the solution? Withdraw from sense gratification and engage in Krishna's service, then all problems of material existence will diminish. So that's the crux. False ego is there, but to defeat false ego, one must overcome by engaging in Krishna's service. But here's the thing, how can the living entity who's entangled in material existence birth after birth understand anything about any devotional service which is beyond material existence? Therefore, the next verse, Mahaprabhu tells Sanatana Goswami, Sadhu Shastra Kripaya Yadi Krishnan Mukha Hai, Se Jiva Nishtare Maya Tare Chadaya. The conditioned soul becomes Krishna conscious by the mercy of saintly persons who voluntarily preach scriptural injunctions and help him to become Krishna conscious. The conditioned soul is liberated from the clutches of Maya, who gives him up. Chadiya Vaishnava Sheva Nishtara Paya Chekeba. Where is that soul who has become liberated by not serving a Vaishnava? Prahlad Maharaj mentions this actually, that when Nishingadev asks him to give a benediction, then Prahlad Maharaj's mood was such that, how can I do anything else other than worship the feet of my spiritual master Narad Muni, who's given me this practice of devotional service that's allowed me to take your darshan. So even Prahlad Maharaj, even before that he's mentioning that when Hiranyakashipu asks him, where have you got this power from? So then, or before that, I'm mixing up maybe. Prahlad Maharaj mentions that actually you cannot understand the Supreme Lord by your own endeavors. You cannot understand the Lord by hearing from other people either. So then you can only understand by the Lord by taking the dust of the feet, nishkinchanana, by taking the dust of the pure devotee's lotus feet. And Prahlad Maharaj's mood is that Naivodvije paraduratya vaitaranyas tvad-virya gayana mahamrita magna chitta sochet tato vimukha chetasya indriyarta maya sukhaya bharam udbhavato vimudhan. That he's saying that I'm perfectly fine, I can cross the ocean of material existence simply by chanting your glories. Naivodvije paraduratya vaitaranyas tvad-virya gayana, by hearing your glorious pastimes. Tvad-virya gayana mahamrita magna chitta. But what is he concerned about? Soche, I am distressed. Soche tato vimukha chetasa indriyarta. Prahlad Maharaj is saying that I can traverse over the Vaitarani river that's separating the material existence from the spiritual existence. So Prahlad Maharaj is liberated. There's no Brahma Bhuta Prasanatma, na sochati na kankshati. For Prahlad Maharaj, no socha. No sochati na sochati na kankshati. He doesn't desire another, he hankers. He doesn't feel that happiness and distress from the material platform. But he's saying, soche tato vimukha chetasya indriyata. Still, he's taking the position of the Lord. Like when Lord tells, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu tells Haridas Thakur that he's worried about the conditioned living entities in material existence, Haridas Thakur says, don't worry, my Lord. So the living entity, especially the devotee, takes up the mood of the Lord to try and alleviate the Lord's anxiety. You see, the Lord created this world, material existence, out of compassion for us to be able to again attain His devotional service again, to again remember Him. So out of anxiety, He's continuously waiting, traveling with the living entity, trying to get the living entity back to Him. But when the pure devotee or a devotee endeavoring to engage in devotional service assists the Lord, how much more the Lord is pleased and satisfied. That not only are you helping yourself by becoming sharp in devotional service, you're also endeavoring to reach out to another living entity so that the purpose of material existence is satisfied. Can you imagine how difficult it would be if no living entities go back home, back to Godhead? How disappointed the Lord would be? Therefore, the devotees voluntarily take the endeavor to come down to material existence to assist the Lord in making this endeavor of the Lord successful. The Lord is successful regardless of whether He needs the devotees' help or not. But just see how the Lord is giving the credit to the devotees. That material existence success is in the devotees coming and preaching Krishna consciousness and bringing living entities out of it. So, Sochetato vimukha chetasi indriyata maya sukhaya bharam udbhavato vimudhan. That the living entity has vimukha chetasa. They have looked away from Krishna. Krishna buliya jeev bhoga vanchakare. They have looked away from Krishna. Nikitasta maya tare jhapati adara. But Maya is slapping him because he has looked away from Krishna and bringing him into material existence. But Maya sukhaya bharam, we are holding or this burden of so-called happiness, Maya sukhaya. The illusory happiness is a burden on our shoulders because that happiness emanates from this false ego, that I am this body, everything in relationship to this body is mine and is meant for my enjoyment. Maya sukhaya bharam udbhavato vimudhan. The super fools, they think in this way. But the devotee is thinking, how can I liberate the living entity from this existence? Therefore, Vidura's talks with Maitreya Rishi is an expansion of the compassion of the devotees. Because who is Vidura? Vidura is Yamaraj. And earlier in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, you'll hear about how Vidura got cursed, or rather Yamaraj got cursed by Mandavya Muni to become Vidura. And there Prabhupada explains that actually this was all enacted by the internal potency of the Lord. Because Yamaraj wanted to preach, being a Mahajan, he was engaged in his service 24/7, which didn't allow him to preach as the other devotees did. In another way he was preaching by punishing the living entities to make sure that they'd get out of material existence, but he was getting fed up with that way of preaching. So he wanted to preach the glories of the Lord by traveling as the other devotees did. So therefore, to satisfy that desire of Yamaraj, Krishna arranged Mandavya Muni to be cursed. Mandavya Muni to curse him. So therefore he took shelter, or he took birth as Vidura, so to satisfy that one desire of preaching Krishna consciousness. So the whole life of Vidura was dedicated to teaching living entities how to get out of material existence. Till the end, Vidura was always engaged in this preaching. In the beginning, he was always preaching to Dhritarashtra. In the beginning, he was always helping the Pandavas. Then, when the Pandavas were exiled, throughout that whole period, he was instructing and advising. Then when he left, he went on pilgrimage and he met Uddhava at the end. Then he's talking to Maitreya Rishi now. Then he'll again go back to Dhritarashtra. Then again he'll go around for pilgrimage and leave his body. The whole while preaching. The whole while engaged in trying to deliver fallen conditioned souls. And he's still doing it through the pages of Srimad Bhagavatam. By the mercy of Krishna, Vidura is still preaching. As we read in Srimad Bhagavatam, the first canto, that Prabhupada's mentioning that there are so many Dhritarashtras out there, and there's a great requirement or need for Viduras to go out and preach to them. But if we simply give them Srimad Bhagavatam, we'll allow Vidura to do what he wanted to do, and preach Krishna consciousness to the unlimited Dhritarashtras out there. So Srimad Bhagavatam is so great that although we read Srimad Bhagavatam and we're reading about false ego, Mahatattva and all of this, passion and that, and it's so confusing, how does this happen, Sutra Tattva and this and that. Srimad Bhagavatam is so merciful that simply by reading this we'll be liberated from material existence. Prabhupada says even if you don't understand, simply give your oral reception to Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam will do the work. Srimad Bhagavatam will cleanse the heart. You don't have to worry. Just simply read and relish Srimad Bhagavatam. Hear Srimad Bhagavatam. That's all. You don't need to do anything else. Srimad Bhagavatam is so merciful that it will help you in cleansing your heart. Now, I've run out of time, but I wanted to talk about how... it's going to take long. Okay. I think I'll end here. So this living entity is separate from false ego, separate from material existence, asanga hiyayam purusha, and the junction of the cause is this false ego, this identification with the material nature. But the living entity can come out of it by engaging in devotional service to the Lord, and that simply works by transferring the engagements of the senses from one's own desire to satisfying Krishna's desire. And that's a great art that's required to be performed under the guidance of the spiritual master. And that's how one is able to come out of material existence, simply by the mercy of a saintly person. Charya Vaishnava Seva Nishterapaya Chakeba. Who is there that is liberated having not served a Vaishnava? And so Prahlad Maharaj also reflects this mood. So then, once we get out of material existence, or at least we're endeavoring, so then we pay our debt, or try to pay our debt back to the spiritual master by reaching out and trying to engage other living entities in Krishna's devotional service. And Srimad Bhagavatam is a prime example of that, especially Vidura and Maitreya Rishi. So Prabhupada says here that Krishna gives the conditioned souls all facilities for rectifying the activities of the false ego, but he does not interfere with their small independence as parts and parcels of the Lord. What's the first step? First step is surrender. If you surrender, to that degree Krishna will reciprocate and pull you out of material existence. So I'll end here. Are there any questions, comments? Okay, thank you very much for listening. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nithai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol.